community. At the current stage, the BRICS countries' participation in GVCs is quite diversified, but still below the average global level. I'm sure our speakers will elaborate more on that, on the figures and on why it happens. At the same time, the current level of the BRICS members' bilateral cooperation within GVCs is not quite high as well. For instance, the Russian volume of bilateral value-added trade exceeds $15 billion just in the case of China. In contrast, Russia's bilateral value-added trade with the other BRICS members is less than $3 billion. So something has to be done about that. Taking into consideration the current level of the BRICS overall cooperation within GVCs, we believe that it's of great need to explore new opportunities for deeper partnership. It's worth mentioning that recent tendencies in the development of GVCs and current pandemic-related risks may even bring new opportunities for the BRICS countries. So let me discuss this a bit more. As it was highlighted in the program of the seminar, modern production and supply strategies form regional and global chains consisting of the various stages of the value creation worldwide. Currently, global value chains have been evolving with the help of new business models due to digitalization processes, as well as the wider dissemination and application of the modern ICTs, including robots, artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, and the Internet of Things. Nowadays, a significant number of companies, while choosing the location of the production facilities, are mainly motivated by the shorter distances to the markets and the possibility to reduce transport costs rather than by the prices of production factors and their availability in the producing country. Besides, new technologies have led to even greater fragmentation of the production processes and the so-called third unbundling of the production chain. It is worth mentioning that modern production is characterized by the possibility of the product's customization. The changes discussed above, on the one hand, may lead to the company's greater vulnerability to such global shocks as the pandemic that we're witnessing now, but on the other hand, create new opportunities for diversification of production, supply chains, and target markets. The spread of the coronavirus pandemic undermined the function of GVCs, both due to the inability of companies to continue their activities and the restrictive measures that were adopted by different countries to combat the pandemic. The current situation may lead to a GVC's crisis both on the supply and the demand side. Taking into consideration all the things that I've stated above, the Russian Federation has proposed the initiative on the participation of the BRICS member countries in regional and global value chains aimed to analyze the existing barriers and possible ways to overcome them. Under the framework of the initiative, we propose to undertake joint research and develop a respective publication. So what could be within this publication? Mainly, there are several areas that we could explore and that needs this exploration. So first of all, identifying key characteristics of the BRICS countries' integration in global and regional value chains. Then reviewing existing domestic policies of the BRICS countries that contribute towards their more effective GVCs participation and higher value-added production. Then reviewing trade and investment measures taken by the BRICS countries in response to COVID-19, evaluating their impact on value chains involving the BRICS members, including in the context of the BRICS countries' effective participation in these GVCs and the opportunities arising for the BRICS to economically upgrade their participation. Another area would be to identify opportunities for rebuilding and creating new GVCs in sectors most affected by COVID pandemic. Next one is compiling respective best practices and policymaking experiences of the BRICS countries, including success story case studies that led to the effective integration of the BRICS economic operators into GVCs, including micro, small, and medium enterprises, but also women-led MSMEs. And as you all well know, being the followers of the BRICS, that this year is also, we are to witness their launch of the Women Business Alliance, and hope this study would also help them in order to, in showcasing, trending the way forward for for better women empowerment. Next area that could be considered is assessing the possibilities and opportunities of involvement of enterprises and companies located in remote and rural areas in regional and global GVCs. This is another, this is part of the wider initiative that was also suggested. Then analyzing the possibilities of developing global and regional GVCs in the services sector, including the development of appropriate digital technologies and e-services with remote access. And last but not the least, based on the results of the research, developing respective recommendations aimed at promoting the participation of BRICS member countries in regional and global value chain, and thus arriving at a high level of cooperation between our 5 countries, but also striving at a deep, not only deeper integration within BRICS, but also with a more participation and higher economic participation of their developing world. As you also might know, it was already pandemics going on, but we had there on April 29th, virtual 24th meeting of the BRICS Contact Group on Economic and Trade Issues. And the initiative has been presented there for BRICS countries' consideration. And we believe that the current webinar will help us facilitate the discussion on GVCs related issues, build a common understanding of the prospects of cooperation within GVCs among the BRICS members from the academia and expert perspective. So I'm quite sure that this is not just another roundtable. This is a very important step in the direction of establishing practical results for higher cooperation between our countries. With that said, I would like to pass the floor over, not just wish the success for the seminar to everyone, but pass the floor over to Tatiana Flegontova, who is not just a brilliant economist and researcher, but also one of the main drivers behind this initiative and behind dealing with those issues. So Tatiana, if you could please take over now.
Professor Panova, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I will be moderating the webinar today. And as Professor Panova said before, today we are going to discuss the issues related to GVCs, the current tendencies and trends of GVCs development, and also the risks which BRICS countries are facing right now in times of pandemic of COVID-19. At the end of the presentation, I believe we will be able to come with some ideas and recommendations on the areas of cooperation between BRICS members. I'm glad to say that actually the representatives from all BRICS economies could join us today, despite their busy schedules and time differences. And thanks for that. As far as we do have the full panel of speakers, I believe it will be wonderful if each one of the speakers will be able to stick to the schedule and will make his or her presentation just in time of 12 minutes maximum. I would like to mention as well that we really welcome the questions from the audience who could join us, and you can send the questions just directly to the chat within the webinar, or via email or WhatsApp directly to the organizers, and all the contacts were shared with you before. So the questions will be answered at the very end of the webinar, after the presentation will be made already. And besides, I believe that if some of you will decide to join the discussion and share his or her views on the level of GVC's development cooperation within BRICS and probably future areas for cooperation, we can also share the ideas at the very end of the presentation. So not to take much time, I would like to pass the floor to our speakers, and I would kindly ask them to talk about several issues. First of all, what are the key risks that the COVID-19 pandemic carries, and what are the consequences for the functioning of the GVCs at the current stage? What are the current BRICS countries' experience and probably even the existing best practices in dealing with the negative effects of COVID-19? And finally, I would like to ask our speakers to talk about areas of cooperation and coordination among the BRICS countries in combating the negative effects of COVID-19. As I said before, we do have the speakers from all BRICS members, and I would like to start with our honorable representative from Brazil, Mr. Ivan Oliveira, who is the Director of Studies, Economic Relations and International Policies of the Institute for Applied Economic Research. Mr. Oliveira, so the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tatiana. Thanks, Victoria and colleagues. It's a pity we're having all this crazy, almost chaos in some parts of the world due to the COVID crisis. And we cannot see each other in person, but anyway, we're getting better with the technologies everywhere. So let me go straight to the point. I'm going to bring you briefly some aspects from Brazil and from the crisis worldwide as I see it, and how they affect the economy and value chains. And maybe bring more doubts than answers, in fact. That's something that at IPE, where I work, we're starting to work on it a little bit more in order to get some papers. Well, we've been discussing a lot of global value chains and how Brazilian trade policy should somehow be revised in order to insert the country into all value chains and in a better way. Then comes the crisis, and we start to see all the changes that we're going to see in the coming years due to the crisis, but not only. So my point here, my first point is that I think the crisis, the COVID crisis, is going to reinforce some of the forces that were there, the structural forces that are changing the world of production, and maybe it's going to be faster than what we thought before. So world economies is in a very difficult year, as we all know. We're expecting, according to some of the estimates that we have up to now, a decrease of -2% in world output. And just to give you a hint of what's going on in Brazil right now in economic terms, for example, our expectations is that in the second trimester of the country will decrease its economic activity up to 25% against the previous trimester, the first 3 months of the year. So that's a huge drop in economic activity, a very important one of the biggest in our economic history. So that's a lot for a country that was starting to do the reforms that are necessary in order to grow. And unfortunately, we're taken with this crisis that is taking out the capacity of the country to produce and integrate into the world. So many doubts are here, because in fact we are just estimating things. So we do not really know how deep will this crisis be in the Brazilian economy, and how that will affect our prospective growth. So obviously that will also impact the way we'll be able to integrate into trade and production trends in the world. So if we take into consideration what is expected for Brazil to grow this year, the estimates are of -5%. So that's also a lot for a country that was not really growing the last couple of years. So lots of uncertainties in Brazil, and lots of uncertainty on how to deal with public, especially in our case, trade and industrial policies in order to give the right incentives for the country to grow in this pandemic context. obviously what we do see worldwide is protectionist pressures are there more and more. They were there previously, obviously here in Brazil too. It's very hard to change Brazilian trade policy for many, due to many causes and obviously interests of the private sector that are getting good fruits out of the protectionist measures are there. But this context tends to reinforce those protectionist pressures everywhere. So what we're seeing is that countries worldwide are starting to see that pressure be for trade or investment measures, and that's something very harmful, obviously, for world trade and world integration. So another aspect that we have to have in mind, when it comes to the integration of the chains itself, be on how we're going to address them politically, globally. So the third aspect I'd like to bring here is there's a structural thing that I think is right now faster than what we thought it would be. That is the US-China fight for leadership in the 21st century. So it was there, but it was not as clear as it is right now. Since last year, it started to be clear, I think, but with the crisis, it is very, very clear for everybody how the fight for leadership will, in fact, affect quite directly the global value chains and the way the world economy is right now working. So global chains will be revised due to political interests and the fight, and we don't want to use the fight, but then this search for leadership from China and the West trying to keep it is definitely something very important. We start to see, be in China or in the US, some ideas on how to reshape the value chains they're leading, in order to reallocate things so that in the case of the US, they can isolate China, or in the case of China, they can get in strength in the value chains where they'll have the leaderships. And that's something very important. China is part of the BRICS, and we're talking about the BRICS here. So the way that those two, and together with some countries in Europe, the way they're going to review their policies when it comes to international productive integration is going to rechange the globalization that we know up to now. So the way countries like Brazil will be able to integrate that globalization will also change. And again, we have more doubts here than answers. What we do see is that that's a very important point, and that should be addressed somehow, I think, in our BRICS context. And now try to get a little bit, let's say, less negative on what's going on in the world and how we can manage this crisis when it comes to production and value chains. I think there are many things that the BRICS countries could do and be together. And let's remember that the BRICS were created and we have done lots of things together when it comes to global economic governance. So that's the main issue that brought us together. And I think, again, we're really in need of reviewing and strengthening global economic governance. This is the moment to do that. So I'd say that if you could have initiatives, be in the G20, as we started to see since April, but also among the BRICS, in order to sustain global growth, that's very important in this moment. Be on that relief, for example, something that we have seen not very, let's say, strongly in the G20 proposal from April, but also on integration. So how we could manage this crisis and rethink governance in a way that we could bring new incentives to global demand and global growth, but also for global integration. Fight protectionism, that's the second thing that's very important. And that's something that is there with the BRICS since the very beginning. If you take all our discussions on trade and economic governance, we've seen fighting protectionism there. So that's a very BRICS flag that we should, again, together put up in a moment where nationalist economics tends to get more room than what we thought it would have up to now. And rethinking multilateralism, the WTO is in a very important crisis right now. It has to do also with this US-China fight for leadership. But again, the international trading system and defending multilateralism is one of the BRICS flags. And we've been having that since the very beginning of the group. So having multilateral rules is definitely something very important. I think in order to navigate the new oceans of economic integration in this crisis. So maybe we could somehow go back to basics when it comes to the BRICS, and then getting those values that brought us together when it comes to not fighting protectionism, defending multilateralism. And we need to review many things about the multilateral trading system, for example, but then again, trying to have a common view on that is very important now, because that's the way we're going to manage the world from now on in this crisis. And obviously, that's the way we're going to manage all those global value chains. If we think of a multilateral trading system with plurilateral trade arrangements that would reinforce trade integration and not rise protectionist measures, for example, that's something very important. The way we're going to address globally with good governance structures, this decoupling from US and China, and how that's going to manage the world somehow. And again, all of our countries are suffering a lot. Maybe China is now leaving the crisis moment, but in Brazil, there are many doubts on how we're going to be able to reinforce our international integration processes in a moment where we do need it. In fact, what we have seen in Brazil the last couple of years is that finally trade and international integration came to the development agenda of the recent governments, and that's something very important. But again, we need to rethink a little bit the way we were dealing with it, and the challenges are many, but I think there are obviously many opportunities here, for the BRICS countries to do more together, and then again, going back to some basic values that brought us together, and try to address this crisis in a new way. Everything seems to be new, but maybe that's not that new. We've seen many different crises in the world since we know it. We've seen many changes in world economic leadership in the world since we know it. So we're in the middle of it. I think the COVID crisis has somehow made it faster for the structural change that we were seeing in the world. And that's a great opportunity, I think, for us to rethink the way we're seeing and thinking the world, and how we can address the crisis with more integration. So value chains should not be part of the problem. Integrating into value chain should be part of the solution, at least that's the way I see it from Brazil, and how I like to see this country addressing the challenges of global value chains integrations right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for sharing your thoughts and your doubts. And I would like to say that actually, in my point of view, it's very important that you mentioned the high level of uncertainty, both in Brazil and worldwide, and also the protectionist pressure which all BRICS members face right now. Anyway, I believe that it's quite important that as I see it, you finished your presentation in quite optimistic way by saying that there are still opportunities for BRICS countries to cooperate. Also within BRICS itself and BRICS platform, and within other international forums such as G20 or even WTO, and BRICS members can play their role in defending multilateralism. So In any case, I believe that your thoughts might be shared also with other BRICS members and other representatives from BRICS countries. And now I would like to pass the floor to our second speaker, who could probably elaborate a little bit and come with some concrete ideas on how BRICS countries may come with the ideas how to cope with current challenges. And in these regards, I would like to pass the floor to our next speaker from India, Mr. Mihir Sharma, who is the head of Economy and Growth Program at Observer Research Foundation. So, Mr. Sharma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slagantsova, and thank you all for arranging this. I think it's a very valuable discussion to have right now. The subject of global value chains in particular is one that is much being discussed in India, and I think it's very important that we both express ourselves in a forum like BRICS and understand what the other BRICS countries think about it. Very briefly, I think, let me just sort of try and set the theoretical ground that we're thinking about here. The idea that we have to first start off with is what has been the impact of this pandemic on global value chains, which are the essential building blocks of 21st century globalization and trade. And I think there are three things that have become clear to us in India and, of course, in many other countries across the world. Three revelations, if you put it that way. The first thing that has become clear is something about the fundamental nature of global value chains that have existed so far, which is that they have prioritized efficiency. So you go to the cheapest location, the cheapest place. Efficiency is how global value chains have been set up. But as a consequence, they are efficient, but they are also fragile. And we have realized now that this fragility is a problem. Robustness, a lack of fragility, ability to survive shocks is important, not just to countries, but also to companies and to individuals. So it is not a national security question. It is not even an economic security question for particular countries. It is important to transnational corporations, to small and medium enterprises, and even to individual households, that global value chains somehow incorporate not just efficiency, so they're not just as cheap as possible, but they also avoid fragility, that they have some kind of ability to survive crises of this sort. So that is the first revelation. They are too fragile. The second revelation is, I think, one that took many companies and countries by surprise, and that is their level of dependence upon individual geographies. So you may, for example, have been a company importing, you thought, from your inputs from multiple countries and multiple corporations across the world. And you thought, therefore, that you were diversified. Your global value chains were diversified. But it turns out that if you actually create a network map of where your imports are coming from, there might be individual bottlenecks somewhere further up the line that nevertheless caused you to have to shut down production if that bottleneck for some reason shut down. And this became particularly clear, I think, to people across the world in the initial stages of the pandemic, when even companies and sectors and industries that did not think of themselves as being dependent on production from the People's Republic of China, nevertheless found that they were in fact dependent upon production from there. So a revelation of the level of dependence was the other fact that I think that many people have taken on board, and that has impacted their decision-making going forward. And the third thing, the third revelation, the third understanding that came to us is that the commitment, an understanding that the commitment to globalization and to trade of many countries and many political leaders and many across the world is not as great and is not as deep as we would have liked it to have been, or was in fact judged by their own statements. So it appears to us that the first reaction of many countries was to shut down exports, to decide to try and figure out exactly what was vital for their own citizens to consume and try to prevent it from leaving the country, or to try and buy it from elsewhere. And while this is maybe politically understandable as a first reaction, we have to understand that the implications going forward, the lessons that people have taken from it are very negative, which is that at a moment of crisis, the trade system will not survive, may not survive political intervention. And that is something that we have to fight back against. A few words now on the Indian experience. I won't go very deeply into how our economy has suffered, but it is sufficient to say that for the first time in 40 to 50 years, we may actually suffer declining growth in this year. That is something that most Indians alive have never seen, never thought they would ever see. We have had the most stringent lockdown of any major economy. We have, for the past, since March 26th, very few of us have left our homes, particularly in areas that are, the most productive parts of the country, which continue to see a fairly stringent lockdown. So it has been lifted in many parts of the country in the past few weeks, past few days, but it is still fairly stringent. So therefore, the economic considerations that we will have to take going forward, the economic constraints, the economic danger that we face is considerable. However, I want to make it clear that we are very optimistic about at least the medium to long-term future. And the reason for that is the following. As it exists, as the current structure of world trade, we believe is something that India does not participate in as much as it should. We are not a large component in most global value chains, at least not to the degree that we think we should be. Our Prime Minister, in fact, was very explicit in his most recent speech on the subject of the economic relief package that the government planned. He constructed his entire vision for our economic future and for the relief plan around the notion that we will have to be able to be more, to be a greater participant in global value chains. This has been something that many economists in India and policymakers have been concerned about for a while. And it is fair to say that all our economic policy going forward will be structured around increasing India's participation in global value chains. We have currently only about 2% of world trade. We are, of course, 20% of the world's population, the third or fourth largest economy, depending on how you measure it. But we do need to increase our participation in trade and in value chains in particular, and that is essentially what all domestic policy has been structured around in this pandemic context. I will say one other thing, which is that we, like a lot of other countries, our first response was to try to the pandemic was to try and reduce, for example, the exports of important medicines. Chloroxyquinine, hydrochloroxyquinine, for example, which many countries believe, with varying levels of scientific justification, many countries believe it is a very important or a possible therapy for COVID-19, is produced in large part in India, and our first response was to, in fact, shut off the exports of it. I think it reflects well on the current Indian leadership that it then stepped back from this initial reaction. And within the first few weeks of the pandemic spread, I think 83 or 84 countries that reached out for increased shipments of hydrochloroquine, in fact, found that India was increasing rather than decreasing imports. So there was an understanding, I think, in New Delhi that we cannot respond to a crisis like this in a purely nationalistic manner. Going forward, how can BRICS think about its particular structure in this context? We have to recognize that BRICS was founded to believe in a multipolar and a multilateral global order. For whatever reason, the global order that we have dealt with in the past 7 to 8 years has not been multilateral enough and has not been multipolar enough. There have been individual locations that have monopolized finance, manufacturing, so on and so forth. If BRICS is to live up to its potential, it has to ensure that multilateralism and multipolarity are converted into a reality in our economic system. And I think that that is how we need to be thinking about our role in the future as components of BRICS. How can we operationalize this? There are several that we need to aspects that we need to look at in particular going forward. I'm glad that MSMEs were talked about earlier. India's exports are, I think, about half of India's exports come from small and medium enterprises. We need to ensure that they are better linked to global supply chains. Typically, they are not currently in India. And also, I know for a fact in at least 2 of the other BRICS countries. And we also need to ensure that we focus on transparency and and openness in how our manufacturing participates in global value chains, in how our financial flows take place, and in how data and goods flow across borders. I think that we have a great role and a great contribution to make in terms of transparency and openness. Once we know where data comes from, where goods come from, where finance comes from, we will be able to make reasonable and important suggestions as to the next phase of globalization, which must be defined by our BRICS principles of multilateralism and multipolarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for your presentation and for your detailed presentation. And I would like to say that I absolutely agree that despite the benefits we get from participating in GVCs, unfortunately, we do face significant challenges, including the ones which were highlighted by Mr. Sharma. These are fragility, dependence, and lack of commitments of the global society. And it's very important to highlight, I guess, that already 2 representatives of different BRICS countries highlight the importance of multilateralism as actually the source for the future development and the source to cope with the current challenges which are facing due to the pandemic. And I would like to say that I absolutely agree that the transparency and openness of the economy, of the trade measures taken by BRICS economies might be of great importance for our cooperation in the future. In particular, I would like to thank Mr. Sharma for sharing the experience and of India combating the pandemic of COVID-19. At the same time, I would like to say that we do have another representative from BRICS country, the country which faced the pandemic earlier than others, and I believe already has particular experience in combating a pandemic of COVID-19 and creating the resilient GVCs. And in this case, I would like to pass the floor to our next speaker from China, Professor Minhao Shang, who is the Dean of Great Bay Area Institute in Guangdong, Hong Kong and Macau, and who is also senior researcher at Guangdong Institute for International Strategies of Guangdong University of Foreign Studies. Professor Shen, please share your ideas and your recommendations for BRICS cooperation. Professor Shen, are you with us?
Yes. Good day and good evening, everyone. I don't know why my background is so beautiful. Maybe it make our BRICS member, our friends, feel ease and control the pandemic. I prepare several page slides. I will share my screen. Okay. Can you see? I'm honored here to share my opinion on the impact of the pandemic on the global industry chain and our BRICS country response. I want to talk about one trend and two possibilities and three suggestions to respond. Firstly, the trend, because of the coronavirus pandemic, the world is going into recession and the industry chain may be fragmented. Firstly, the outbreak of coronavirus pandemic could trigger a new global recession. Before the outbreak of pandemic, China's economic growth has slowed down, as we all know, and the global economy is also close to recession. 6 to 7 of the world's top 10 economies are on the brink of recession. The stagnation of consumption in China under the new coronavirus epidemic has made a great impact on the service industry. The delay of resumption of work has caused difficulties in business operation, and the global economy has a chain effect. Although China take the decided measures to shut down some cities, stop crowd gathering, stop elementary school, stop college. It took 6 weeks for China to control coronavirus epidemic domestically. At the bottom of February, people began to return to work to maintain the supply chain. In February, China's manufacturing PMI plummeted from 50 to 35, while non-manufacturing PMI plummeted from 54 to 29. It is the lowest in the history. Especially the service industry is unlikely to speed up production after the epidemic to make up for the losses. The top 10 economies in the world have become the disaster area of epidemic. It is estimated that the economy of US, China, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and South Korea, and the other countries will slow down significantly. In today's highly globalized economy, the world will have a chain reaction, and the downward trend of the world economy will increase. Secondly, the epidemic has increased the possibility of fragmentation of global industry chain. China's delayed resumption of work has disrupted many industrial and supply chains. In terms of the industrial segmentation, the short-term of breaking pain is the consumer electronic and automobile industry. Affected by the cut-off part supply in China, international enterprises in automobile, electronic, and other industries almost stopped production. South Korea and Japan have the biggest impact. Geographically, Vietnam and other downstream factories have a great impact. Although they return to work, but the inventory can only be maintained for another week. Nintendo in Japan, affected by the supply chain, is preparing to reduce the production of its best-selling game consoles. United States consumer electronics are also affected, and Apple plans to delay the launch of the new iPhone. The transmission effects of supply chain disruption is now beginning to reach Europe and United States. From now on, the possibility of supply chain rupture in the US and Europe increase. And next bit. And the global manufacturing supply chain should have 3 important time nodes. That is 3 months, half a year, and 3 years. The impact in the medium term is the emergence of retaliatory capacity to respond to others, resulting in excessive recovery of global factory. In the long term of 3 to 5 years, the industrial chain and the supply chain may be further fragmented. Moreover, the upgrading of the international epidemic may in turn lead to suspension of China's foreign demand and the disruption of parts of supply chain. As far as the current trend is concerned, the epidemic peak outside China may not come until the end of second quarter. The virus has spread in manufacturing countries such as South Korea, Japan, and Germany, and the world industrial chain has further broken, which in turn will curb China's recovery, further drag down the global economy. And there are 2 possibilities or 2 kinds of opinions for future industrial chain layout. The first is that part of world's industrial chain may break into several plates. The deepening degree of global vertical division of labor reached its peak in 2014, and the trend of shortening the industrial chain began to appear. The trend of deglobalization may be aggravated after the outbreak of epidemic. Western industrialized countries may pay more attention to the integrity of their industry system and tend to achieve closed loop in a smaller space area, especially with the rise of anti-globalization trend in some big countries. Some of the world's industrial chain are in danger of breaking into multiple plates. And the second possibility is on opposite. The industrial chain of trade center country is more and more important in the world. The epidemic crisis will slow down the trend of industrial chain relocation since the trade war. The global economy downturn was caused by the epidemic. Multinational corporations reduced the investment to protect themselves. Industrial return to developed nations meant relocation and new investment. Moreover, China's management ability to in the resumption of production further verifies its manufacturing advantage compared with other emerging markets. The epidemic also exposed the weakness of the industrial industrial chain of some emerging manufacturing transfer countries. Before the epidemic, some companies plan to invest in a new factory outside China or increase automation investment in their own country. Now these intentions have been postponed. And the next, we have 3 suggestions to respond for our BRICS members. Number 1 is accelerate the construction of 5G data center, IoT, and other digital infrastructure, and promote transformation of supply technology. Is what we should do. New technology and new business may be born in every crisis. Now, almost all in cloud become new consumption customer in China, including office online, meeting online, education online, medical treatment online, cooking online. The cloud industry grows rapidly. So BRICS countries should form their advantage in future commercial infrastructure as soon as possible. Number 2, we should encourage the upstream and the downstream joint development of manufacturing enterprises and promote the supply side technology upgrading. The aggravation of the epidemic situation increase the risk of supply interruption in the industrial chain. In the future, we need to pay more attention to the industrial efficiency and the balance of the upstream and downstream of the industrial value chain. Number 3, we will further expand, opening up and create a smooth global market. The trade center countries can take advantage of economic size and market scale, continue to deepen the opening up, the access of foreign capital, create a fair, open, and unified international market, and ensure the global supply chain smooth and connected. So finally, in a word, I want to use this word to end my topic. If winter comes, can spring be far behind? We need more cooperations to boost global confidence in winning the battle against the coronavirus pandemic. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shen, and thank you for sharing Chinese experience. It's of great importance for us to understand which measures China used to combat COVID-19 in economic terms and how much time did it take to cope with the challenges. I also would like to thank you for sharing your perspectives and concrete recommendations on what can be done for GVC's development, taking into consideration all the challenges mentioned before. So, and in these regards, I would like to highlight once again that it's very important to pay attention to the development of digital economy and ICT technologies. Besides, I also believe that it's of great importance to create and ensure the balance between different parts of the supply and global chain, including downstream and upstream parts of the global value chain. And I would like to thank you again for sharing your views on how important it is to keep the economy open and protect multilateralism and openness of our economies. So thanks for the presentation and your ideas on the development of GVCs within BRICS countries. And in following our discussion, I would like to pass the floor to our next speaker and invite Mr. Cyril Prinsloo, the Senior Researcher and the Economic Diplomacy Program of South African Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Prinsloo, the floor is yours. You have your 12 minutes for your presentation.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with you today, to share this platform with you today, and to discuss some of the issues around value chains, specifically in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think some of our earlier speakers, and in particular Dr. Shen, has highlighted for us some of the key short-term and medium challenges in terms of supply and demand disruptions that many businesses in South Africa, certainly across the BRICS and across the world, have experienced. I think for my very brief intervention here today, I want to focus on one of the trends related to GVCs, and certainly that the COVID-19 epidemic has highlighted. One of the longer term trends that I see, that I think is a very negative development, specifically for the BRICS and developing countries. And this theme that we've been tracking for a while, specifically relates to GVC nationalism. Of course, Dr. Ivan has mentioned this earlier as well. But what we mean with GVC nationalism is a process where countries are starting to reshore operations, where they try to kind of, over the past decades, where we saw a fracturing of value chains, to bring production processes back home, or at least to closer geographical areas. And I think this GVC nationalism, the so-called GVC nationalism that we've seen build up and again, intensified under this current epidemic period, has been driven by a number of factors. One is obviously politics and geopolitics. I think as we've seen global geoeconomic weight shift from the west towards the east, that has created tension. And we see in the US, for example, recently, encouraging American firms to bring back their production, their manufacturing to the United States, by creating tax breaks or subsidies, etc. I think we have to be realistic and say that this process of reshoring, and again, I think some of our previous speakers have alluded to this, has also been very much driven by businesses themselves. I think Dr. Sharma mentioned this in terms of mitigating risks, so creating shorter supply chains. This kind of GVC nationalism is driven by businesses that wants to bring those supply chains closer geographically. Now, the reason why I wanted us to just pause and reflect on this is because I think this trend of GVC nationalism has a significantly negative impact on the BRICS and other developing countries as well. I think firstly, there's a couple of negative impacts. Firstly, this GVC nationalism will lock developing countries out of GVCs, or it could potentially relegate them to lower tiered value-added sectors, which is not ideal. It also locks them out of some of the benefits that we've seen countries accrue from participating in GVCs, in terms of benefiting from the capital flow, access to international markets, the human capital and knowledge flows that cross these value chains. Secondly, also again, as we saw throughout this current pandemic, it creates significant challenges in supply for countries, and I think a lot of, or at least some countries, instituted export bans on essential goods, whether that's testing kits or PPE equipment, which has created challenges for countries that don't have those production facilities domestically. The third reason why I think this is a negative trend, obviously, it raises production costs. by manipulating value chains in a manner that's not the most efficient, raises production costs, and that obviously has a negative consumer welfare effect. And then the final reason why I think this is a key challenge for us, and why the BRICS and other developing countries should guard against this trend. We've seen in many African countries throughout the latter part of the 20th century, well, at least this GVC nationalism creates kind of a global bipolarization or a polarizing effect between different parts of the global economy. And I think from an African perspective, we saw in the latter part of the 20th century that this kind of polarization of global politics and economics is extremely challenging and damaging for many developing countries. So those are some of the issues why I think this kind of growing trend of GVC nationalism should be countered. And I guess the key question for us today, what can the BRICS do about this? What should we do about this? And here I think there's two dimensions to it. I think the first dimension relates to intra-BRICS economic relations, and the second dimension, as some of our colleagues have also mentioned, relates to BRICS's efforts towards reforming global economic governance. But I want to just briefly reflect on how the BRICS can address this within the bloc. I think Dr. Panova at the outset of this discussion highlighted some key activities that's currently ongoing in terms of research and policymaking to facilitate GVCs across BRICS countries, which I think is very important. I think another important point is to increase intra-BRICS investment. I think we've seen over the past decades that there's been significant growth in trade between the BRICS countries, but we've seen intra-BRICS investment remain fairly low. Now, of course, I think one of the key objectives this year under Russia's presidency is revising the 5-year strategy on BRICS economic cooperation, or drawing up the new strategy for the next 5 years. And I think that, you know, increasing investment between the BRICS should really be a central pillar of this strategy going forward. I think in the past, we've also had, you know, the BRICS has always been very proud of the people-to-people connections that we've established over the past 10 years, with that the kind of business-to-business linkages. But I think there's scope for us to grow that. If I recall correctly, in 2016, there was a massive BRICS business fair where suppliers and buyers from BRICS countries came together. And I think this is certainly something we should look at again, once conditions, of course, allows for this. Then in terms of enhancing intra-BRICS trades to strengthen the value chains amongst ourselves, I think we must also recognize the fact that each respective BRIC is a significant regional partner in each of their respective regions. And I really think we should do more to leverage these positions for our businesses, our firms, to pivot into respective regional markets. Of course, you know, we use the example of Brazil being within Mercosur, South Africa being within the Southern African region, and soon the continental free trade area. And we should really use the BRICS platform to create these connections for our businesses to then also operate in our respective regions. Then the final point I want to make relates to BRICS as a bloc. What can the grouping do? And as some of our former colleagues have mentioned, the BRICS have always been a key proponent of change in global governance. And I think, especially within the G20, I think the BRICS need to keep on coordinating our position on these issues, specifically in this case, of course, guarding against GVC nationalism. Any kind of conversation that any attempts in global discussions that would promote such activity, we need to guard against. And I think while this is kind of stating the obvious, you know, as this is a growing trend, I think it's useful for us to keep reminding ourselves of this, and that we should keep guarding against this. I think we also need to remember that BRICS, of course, as individual countries, also participate in other key global discussions, and I'm thinking here specifically of the OECD, where each of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, we all participate in different frameworks of the OECD. But even in those discussions with the OECD or other international forums where we participate, we should continue the position that we need to counter this growing nationalization of GVCs. And then the final point, and again, I think some of our former colleagues have alluded to this, is just within the WTO. Of course, the BRICS have always been consistent in promoting or advocating for a rules-based multilateral system. Again, you know, as we see stresses on the system, it's important to maintain that position. I think, of course, naturally, given the structure of our economies within the WTO, there will, of course, be some disagreement on certain technical issues, but I think we can all agree on the principles of the WTO, of the importance of bilateral trade system, the importance of policy space within the system for developing countries to help our nascent industries, the importance of the dispute settlement unit. Again, I think those basic principles of the multilateral trade system we can coalesce around and promote a united front, not just for the BRICS, but for developing countries across the world. Thank you, colleagues. I'm gonna leave it there for now.
Thank you, Mr. Prinsloo. Thank you for sharing the views from South African perspective and also elaborating on ideas which kind of impact will recent trends and tendencies of GVC's development will have on BRICS economies, including such tendencies as reshoring and so-called nationalism of GVCs. I would like also to thank you for particular and very concrete recommendations, both in terms of intra-BRICS cooperation and BRICS cooperation on the international arena, including such platforms as OECD and the WTO is of particular importance. I would like to mention that actually we will have some questions regarding BRICS positions on WTO reform, but as I said, it will be better if we address these questions after the presentations are made already. So following the discussion, I would like to invite the next speaker of our seminar, Dr. Alexander Daniltsev, Director of Institute of Trade Policy at High School of Economics University, who will present Russia's perspective on the current development of GVCs. Professor Daniltsev, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for participation, for possibility to participate again. Well, the subject of the discussion is very important, really important for us now and for the world, for the whole world economy. Well, because the pandemic is a very severe and and so to say, a stress test for the world economy, national economies. And unfortunately, now yet we don't know the final facts. Well, as we see, the estimates are very different. I mean, the estimates of the negative effects of the pandemic. And unfortunately, the general trend now here is now a move to more and more negative effects and estimates for deep recession. At first, the main attention was to the industries related to traveling sector and some related services like tourism and hotels and others. But now we see that actually all industries are somehow affected. Well, as for our countries, I mean the BRICS countries, yeah, all our countries depend on exports very much. We are export-dependent countries. And that's why we are maybe the biggest and the most representative group of big economies interested in smooth and dynamic development of world trade. In this respect, we radically differ from, for example, the United States, because the latter, they are not so related, are so dependent on international trade and export markets. Well, that's why protectionism is very dangerous for us, and especially now, as before the pandemic, the situation in the world economy was not very good. Many experts say now that some recession was possible even without pandemic, and many problems coincided now. Some problems like slow growth, trade wars, well, legal nihilism trade, and attacks on WTO, and vice, and even more, why WTO now experience some internal problems and need a serious reform. Well, the influence and dependence on GVC during such crisis on trade and economic development, for me, is not clear, because now it is not just a pure economic problems we face, but some natural economic logic of development now is affected by and biased some non-economic factors and difficulties in working the usual ways of cooperation and logistics net and so on. That's why usual trade and economic relations are strongly tested and affected now by a complex of negative factors. As for us and the Trade Policy Institute and Higher School of Economics, we are working intensively on analyzing the effect of pandemic on world trade, and now are going to prepare some publications on the results. But what we see now, that and it is, I think it it is well, unfortunately, very serious, very serious, item that we're sure that the collapse of international cooperative links and production net, so the what we call now GVC, is the worst scenario. And among all possible scenarios is the most dangerous and most negative. So that it is very important somehow to help the GVC to work further and somehow to restore. Well, a very important thing is time. we see that pandemic effect is not simultaneous all over the world. And now we are looking at a kind of wave going around the world. This wave is going around from Asia to Europe, to North America, to Latin America, and so on. So that time is very important. And even more, the effects will be observed not I think the effects will be observed not just only now, but in some time later, because we know that the usual time of traveling of goods, for example, from the producer to consumer is up to 6 months and even more. In spite of the all modern transport technique and so on. So that all these commercial links will experience the stress for some time. And it is very important for the estimation of the possible effects of the pandemic crisis. To save time, what seems to be important? Well, first of all, it is necessary somehow to combat the protectionism and to block attempts to use the current difficulties to improve the positions in world trade and global economy, and especially through such methods like trade wars. It is necessary somehow to strengthen the legal foundations of the international trade, the system of multilateral regulations. It is a very important task because this system is experiencing some difficulties now. Everyone knows it, but it is very important for the smooth development of trade and for somehow for following of rules and for ability to use the legal foundations for our cooperation. Well, there are some traditional issues to improve and some new issues to develop. Well, as for new issues for the multilateral system, first of all, I need to say that WTO is for sure the best platform for discussion and for implementation of some decisions, of possible decisions. I can pinpoint some initiatives which could be important. For example, the initiative of WTO members to somehow develop a new agreement devoted to some extraordinary situations. For example, some initiatives in the area of trade in medicine goods, because now it is clear that as we face such serious crisis related to some health problems, it is important to improve the mechanisms regulating the trade and exchange of medicine goods and services. Of course, it is a matter of producing some special mechanisms for some extraordinary crisis situations for the operations of international trade and economic relations between countries in some special extraordinary environment. This time it is health problems, but it can be some other issues, for example, climate change or some global catastrophe, so that it is really a good idea, and somehow I think it can help to cooperate. It can help to cooperate, to open some gate for more and more open and intensive cooperation between WTO members, because it is very important to provide for such cooperation and for well, just mutual mutual discussions. Well, another issue is, of course, rules and regulations in area of digital trade and digital economy. Of course, this very important and fast developing area needs some common approach and disciplines. I will especially use this word disciplines because now we are, of course, at the first stage of development of this, well, I would say universe, economic universe. And of course, just now, companies are very free and they are, well, just they are the main place in this area. And it is very good because it is natural at this stage, but still all our experience shows that well, it is necessary to have some rules of play and some even disciplines to provide for example, well, it is the most simple example, but to provide for consumers' rights. Yes, and all that regulations and even disciplines, in fact, they provide for more convenient and more comfortable environment for business, because business knows for sure the rules. Well, next, some more traditional areas. At the first place, I would say it is time somehow to think about investment. We know that there were many attempts somehow to develop multilateral system, multilateral instruments for regulating investment and stimulating it, but we don't see good progress here. So, well, I think it's time somehow to think how to facilitate cooperation in this area, and to my mind, BRICS countries are very important for it, and it is a very important and very prospective area for cooperation between them. Well, further, well, some general thoughts concerning the multilateral system. Well, our world is changing, and all the existing rules and regulations and approaches are well oriented on some disciplines and rules. But I think that it's time to think about somehow a little bit different approach, more approach, I think. Of course, it doesn't mean that we somehow can ignore the existing rules, principles, and disciplines, but maybe we can add something more, an idea of management. An idea of management, because now we well, the main basement is only just the negotiation and the negotiation power. But I think that WTO, for example, as the most powerful international organization in the area of trade, and in fact economic cooperation, can think about further steps, how to not just to regulate, I mean not to regulate, but also manage the application of instruments and the regulations of international trade. For example, we face such problems not related to pandemic, but for example, the food security, and it is very closely related to regulation in the area of agricultural subsidies. And it shows, well, in future, the global agriculture can face problems connected to climate change. And it is very important to somehow take into consideration when deciding some problems of support in agriculture, not only just negotiation results, but also the real developments in trade, in agricultural production, and so on. Also some, again, a few words about BRICS countries. Again, I would say that our common interest is stable growth, legal rules, and development of international trade. So that is all these directions are the basement for our cooperations, just on bilateral format, and in some multilateral organizations like WTO. I think all that issues I mentioned, they somehow can be directly related to the development of cooperation and development of global value chains, because all that items are somehow provide for comfortable and suitable environment for development of global chains of supply, division of labor, and these global value chains. So that thank you very much for your attention. I will be glad to answer questions if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Daniltsev, and thank you for sharing your ideas, and definitely we'll be looking forward to new publications prepared by economics, the publication you just mentioned during your presentation. And as I see it now, all BRICS countries are of the same position that WTO and multilateral trading system are key for the resilient and smooth development of global trade, even more so in terms of challenges we are facing right now, such as pandemic of COVID-19. And given the example of trade in pharmaceuticals or medical products, so it's of great importance to ensure the smooth development and functioning of a World Trade Organization. Digital trade, as Professor mentioned, is another issue, and it's of more importance if we see the great role which ICT plays during the pandemic in different countries. So, but let us move forward, and we do have another presentation from our honorable guest from South Africa. And let me invite Dr. Philaniem Tembu, the Executive Director of Institute for Global Dialogue from South Africa. Professor Tembu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for the invite and the opportunity to discuss what is an important and will be gaining in importance question. I'll structure my next maybe 7 to 10 minutes max around the following points. I'll firstly just go into a little bit on the global context, whether we're moving towards a fragmented global order, and then touch a bit on the South African experience, the African response, the impact of COVID-19, health, economy, and ecology, and then also what role for the African continental free trade area and regional value chains. And then the last point is going to be on partnership with BRICS and external partners. So I think, you know, the reality is that COVID-19 catches the world at a time where, when facing a global pandemic, you would ideally want the greatest amount of cooperation amongst the both countries in the north and countries in the south. But unfortunately, this pandemic caught us at a time where global cooperation was coming under pressure. In fact, countries that were even important in establishing the multilateral trading system and multilateral order in general are some of the countries who are now actually fighting against that. I mean, you take an example of the World Trade Organization and some of the pressure that it's come under, especially the dispute resolution mechanism. That's going to take some movement, you know, particularly from the United States to actually overcome. You look at the state of the World Health Organization. The US at a time when the world is dealing with a major crisis, pulling out resources, you know, so that's the type of world that this pandemic finds us in, where cooperation has become increasingly difficult, where the multilateral order is under growing strain, but also where you having a blurring between, you know, the global south and the global north. You look at the type of cooperation taking place. You have southern countries supporting northern countries in dealing with the pandemic. You have poorer countries in the global south who were even supporting and sending whatever they could send to China just when it started. You know, in terms of the South African experience, I think you find that South Africa moved quite decisively in terms of the lockdown. And you found that there was a general consensus within society amongst political parties that, you know, there should be a lockdown. And in fact, South Africa's lockdown was called one of the most strictest in the world. However, that consensus, which was there nationally, is coming under increasing strain and under increasing pressure as different interest groups try to put out their positions around the reopening of the economy. So while we found, you know, a consensus in moving into lockdown and a non-partisan approach towards locking the country down, that has come under strain as the country begins to reopen, because different sectors are obviously pushing their interests. You have different views within the scientific community. And I think we're finding that reopening the economy at a time where there isn't a vaccine, at a time where there isn't a confirmed treatment, is proving somewhat more difficult than actually locking down the economy. So that's where South Africa is. But I think the country did rely a lot on its previous experience in dealing with pandemics, you know, such as HIV and AIDS. South Africa has one of the largest, if not the largest, state program on HIV and AIDS. And it could rely on that network and that infrastructure, that health infrastructure within the country, to go out, send health practitioners to poor communities and do mass screenings and so forth. And I think that's going to be important as we reopen the economy, and essentially where our ability to track and trace cases will be tested. In terms of the African response, I think it's been interesting in a sense that A lot of the countries actually went into lockdown, some of them even before they had detected cases. And it also just shows that countries with generally few resources at certain times were actually taking this pandemic more seriously than some other countries with greater resources, because they know the challenges of dealing with epidemics. I mean, these countries on the continent and regions have been dealing with pandemics. They've been dealing with HIV and AIDS. They've been dealing with Ebola when it broke out. And they're taking lessons of their previous engagement into this. But the continent is facing challenges in terms of obviously securing equipment to deal with the health crisis that is coming. We're not yet the epicenter globally. You know, it moved from China, Southeast Asia to Europe, United States, now moving into Latin America. But in Africa, the numbers are still a lot lower than the rest of the world. But even then, I think a challenge has been trying to coordinate the African response to COVID-19. South Africa is currently chair of the African Union. And one of the things that they're trying to see is whether they can ensure that on the continent, we don't have a situation where countries that are bigger are able to secure supplies, whereas the smaller countries are not able to secure supplies. So there's a lot of coordination taking place around there. And I think what's going to be important is that whilst in Africa, the big challenge is not necessarily at the moment the health crisis of COVID-19. However, it catches the continent at a time when for the last 15 years, African countries, at least 6 or 7, have been amongst the fastest growing economies in the world. And now with, essentially, the oil prices having been, taken a nosedive in terms of a global shutdown, a lot of these economies, it's affecting obviously their development trajectory. So we might find that whilst in Africa, it's not inevitable that COVID-19 will turn out to be as much of a health crisis as it is in parts of Europe, the US, and Latin America. However, the economic impact of COVID-19 is going to be felt quite strongly. And also it's important to keep in mind that the economic crisis that accompanies COVID-19 is only exceeded by an even greater ecological crisis, which we need to also face. What role for the African Continental Free Trade Area? And there, I think this is where the importance of regional value chains is important. So in Africa, the question of regional value chains has been important way before this global pandemic. And what the pandemic has shown is the importance of this issue of establishing regional value chains. The various regional economic communities all have their own regional industrialization strategies and so forth. And these will need to be supported moving forward, because if it's one thing that it's exposed is that the continent remains vulnerable compared to other parts of the world. In terms of even sourcing the equipment, it means that if other countries are becoming more nationalistic, then the continent finds itself at the back of the queue. And that's not a sustainable position for a continent that by 2050 would have doubled its population to approximately 2 billion, a rising middle class. We need to have and support the establishment of regional value chains within the continent. And this has nothing to do with being against globalization or being critical of globalization. However, it's about actually strengthening the continent's ability to cooperate globally. Because if the value chains if there are no value chains on the region, it actually inhibits the continent's ability to cooperate with the rest of the world, and it decreases the continent's agency and resilience. So I think what we're going to be moving towards is not just focusing only on efficiency, but we have to focus on the resilience also of these value chains. And the regional value chains are an important layer of the global value chain. So we have to see it in that manner, and not about not about necessarily critiquing globalization. You're actually strengthening the ability of the world to cooperate if the regional value chains are stronger. And this is where the continent, in terms of its partnerships with the BRICS countries and other external partners, it's going to be important. Each of the BRICS countries have important initiatives in engaging with the continent. Russia is currently our chair this year, and Russia last year initiated the Russia-Africa Summit. You talk about China. You've got the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and its Belt and Road Initiative. You've got India. You've got your India-Africa Forum Summit. We know that also Brazil has various engagements within the continent, even though in recent years it was decreasing the number of embassies. However, the continent needs to work with these partners in ensuring that it's able to not only be a source of raw materials, but that its partners are also building and investing in manufacturing within the continent. Because if Africa's population will double, then over time it makes sense for some of the corporations in the BRICS countries and globally to actually set up their operations closer to what will become increasingly an important market for their operations. And if they're able to support the continent in meeting its own objectives of building regional value chains, then I think then this crisis would have been a good catalyst to actually re-emphasize some of those points. I think let me leave it there, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mtembo. Thank you for sharing the ideas from South African perspective, and as I understand it, even more from African perspective in general. I guess it's very important that you mentioned South African experience in combating previous diseases which were widespread in your country. Unfortunately, South Africa had this experience before, but I believe that all countries, including BRICS nations, will need to understand the experience, the measures which have been taken before to combat the diseases. So I believe also that it's quite important that you mentioned the importance not only of the measures which can be taken on the national level, but regional level as well, and the importance of regional cooperation, as in your example of cooperation within Africa and African Union, and probably the same cases might be mentioned in terms of different regions, including Russia and Eurasian Economic Union, for example. And the last point I would like to highlight here is I believe it's needed to say once again that the current crisis showed that global value-added chains development should be not only in terms to ensure GVC's effectiveness, but also its resiliency. And I guess these are the things and trends which should be considered. So, dear colleagues, we do have one more presentation, and the last but definitely not the least speaker, my colleague and researcher at Russia APEC Studies Center, Olga Ponomarova. So, Olga, the floor is yours. Please share your ideas with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm also very happy to participate in today's discussion and I prepared presentation slides that I would like to share with you. Give me a second. So let me start. Okay, as a lot has already been said, I do my best to be brief and add some valuable inputs and insights on GVCs and the impact of coronavirus pandemic from Russian perspective. In my presentation, I would like to cover the next. I would like to talk about some fundamental trends and the moment of COVID pandemic outbreak. Some statistical facts about Russian participation in global value chains, sectoral observations of COVID short-term implications, and I would like to share with you some findings and general recommendations. Despite the recent trends of global trade slowdown and growing protectionism and uncertainty, the development of digital technologies creates the basis for trade facilitation and cooperation in global value chains. Moreover, ongoing modernization of production processes and increasing necessity to cut labor and transportation costs become the key drivers for reshoring and reorientation of global value chains. COVID outbreak made companies to review their global production and marketing strategies to minimize external risks and to minimize external risk in case of GVCs disruptions. Thus, the pandemic formed additional strong incentives for changes in traditional GVCs patterns. As for Russia's participation in GVCs, it started to intensify in the middle of the previous decade. Among BRICS economies, China and India are leading partners in bilateral GVCs. The main areas of cooperation you may see on this slide. Going forward, in terms of COVID pandemic, it is important to reveal Russian industrial sectors that depend on foreign value added most of all. And taking into account the value added in Russia's exports and the final demand, we may point out such sectors as agriculture and food production, production of motor vehicles, electrical machinery and equipment, and pharmaceuticals. And exactly these sectors are analyzed further as ones of most sensitive to GVC's disruptions. It is worth mentioning that leading suppliers of value added to Russia in these industries which are considered, it is the countries that were affected most of all by coronavirus lockdowns and other restrictions. And as you can see in the tables presented, BRICS economies are among the top suppliers of value added to Russia in these sectors. As for the short-term impact, here you can see some observations on trade dynamic and market conditions. All in all, recent statistics on foreign trade provided by Eurasian Economic Commission and Russian Federal Customs Service showed that all industries under consideration faced the decrease in imports of parts and components in the first quarter of 2020. A high degree of dependence on supplies from China, European countries, India, increased the risks and forced companies to seek some alternatives. Companies which managed to make some reserves and used more domestic inputs found themselves a little bit better according to they presented in interviews. As for some findings, these sectoral observations, I would like to follow with the recommendations, and among the main, which I suppose are in line with those highlighted by previous speakers, I would like to mention that minimization of risks associated with GVCs disruptions through diversification is reasonable on all three levels: global, regional, and national. Limiting this diversification only to the expansion of self-reliance policies may lead to other risks, so this process should be balanced. Moreover, competitive quality of products and harmonization of national technical standards with the international ones are additional factors for flexibility in global value chains and ability to switch between different suppliers and customers. As transportation and logistics continue to generate the growing share of trade costs, and the role of regional GVCs development can't be underestimated. And last point, but I believe not the least, is devoted to GVCs digitalization. It definitely increases sustainability of production process through diminishing the role of human labor or the quantity of it needed. But this trend should be adequately met by from the government side policies. All the aspects mentioned above may become the areas of BRICS cooperation and coordination in GVC development, I believe. Thank you very much. That's it.
Olga, thank you very much for the presentation. I believe it was very detailed and informative. And thanks again for sharing some concrete examples of concrete industries and the ways how they were affected by the pandemic, and probably some recommendations which can be done in terms of combating pandemic and its economic effects on particular industries. So, dear colleagues, I guess we came to the part of the webinar when we are ready to address some questions. And we do have several questions. I just would like to pick some of them. First of all, I would like to address the question from Alexandra Arhangelskaya, and she has question to our speaker, Professor Filani Mtembu. So if you may, I will just read it out. Dear Filani, thank you for your interesting presentation. In your opinion, what would be the scenario of South Africa opening economy? What consequences are going to be in what areas? What impact this will have on South African role in the region and in Africa as a whole? What is going to be South African role in Southern African Development Community and in Africa at African Union? What are perspectives of economic integration in Africa after COVID-19? So, Dr. Mtembu, please, if you have the answers.
Sure. I think just lastly on this, I think regional integration is going to be even more important because, I mean, if you take into account that intra-regional trade in Africa is still probably not more than 20%, and that's a very low number. And that tells you that there's much more potential within the continent and for the continent to be trading with each other. It's not sustainable for countries on the continent to have lesser trade barriers for external actors than they do with their own neighbors. And I think, so the African Continental Free Trade Area, at least the period when everyone starts using it is now delayed, so it will be 2021. But I think we should use that period between now, while countries are dealing with COVID-19, to imagine really and be innovative about how an African Continental Free Trade Area will work, because we can't just copy and paste from other regions. We live in a continent with the highest number of least developed countries. So you're essentially having a free trade agreement in a continent with mostly least developed countries, which means you need a different type of model. And I hope that we will move towards a situation where we have a more endogenous approach rather than just copying and pasting from somewhere else. So I think regional integration will become much more important post COVID-19 and must become more important. And I just think in South Africa, we're grappling with opening up. So I mean, in June, we're moving to a lower stage in terms of we've got 5 stages of the lockdown. We're now moving from 5 to 4 and then to level 3. The big cities have been the ones which have been affected the most. I mean, Cape Town is basically our hotspot right now. Also Johannesburg, but I mean Cape Town, the numbers are currently much more than 50% than in other parts of the country. But I think that the lockdown hopefully has bought government and the private sector time to actually prepare the health sector, and also to increase the number of beds that are available. I mean, we're not in a situation like other hotspots in Europe and elsewhere, where hospitals have become overrun because of these cases. So what we're hoping is that as we reopen, is that the capacity of hospitals has also been increased and is able to deal with cases as they arrive. If we deal efficiently with the crisis in South Africa, I think it will enhance our ability to also lead a coordinated response from the continent. However, if we mishandle the opening up of our economy, it will inhibit our ability to also coordinate responses on the continent. So the stakes are high, but I think so far, you know, there's no perfect country that's dealt with COVID-19. But I think so far, you know, the country has done relatively well. I know there's growing contestation now politically and amongst the different economic sectors. But, you know, you just hope that with all of that, that we can gradually open the economy whilst also ensuring safety for everybody else. And if we're able to do that, it will just, I think it will impact positively on our leadership role within Africa.
Thank you, Dr. Filani, for your detailed answer. And the next question is from Tatiana Isachenko. I guess this question was addressed to all speakers, as far as almost all our colleagues addressed the issues related to the development of World Trade Organization and the role of multilateral trading system. So Tatiana Isachenko asks, it would be interesting to know the opinion of the distinguished speakers on the following issue. Do you believe there are prospects of more active coordination of the positions of the BRICS countries in the main areas of the WTO reform and its mechanism and instruments? So I would like now ask Mr. Sharma to answer this question, and probably he will be followed by Dr. Shan and other speakers. So Mr. Sharma, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. I think I will be very brief. The issue at the WTO right now is twofold. The first is, of course, the inability to come to a consensus on the appellate body. And I think that here very definitely some form of coordination will be necessary. It is vital that the WTO get itself sorted out, and particularly that the dispute resolution aspect of the WTO, which is crucial for international trade, is not lost. It's crucial for global value chains in particular, and that's not lost. There is a larger issue here, which I think that we will need to think about going forward. And that is that the WTO did evolve in a different time. It evolved at a time when there was a very clear division between developing and developed countries. And it is understandable now that several developing countries are playing a larger part in the international trading system, that some in the developed world want to see this particular mechanism reformed. Now, I understand this is a very, very difficult thing to think about, but it is very important for us to take on board the fact that commitment in the developed world to the WTO will only decline unless we in the developing world also understand that the parameters have changed. So we have to start as emerging economies, as the pole for emerging economies, which is what BRICS originally imagined itself as. We have to start thinking about how it is that the original form of self-certification for developing economies can be updated to take into account the new world in which we now live. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shen?
Oh, okay. I think the BRIC countries should take more important role on WTO reform, because the role of WTO was made by developed countries, especially G7 countries. But for first time in nearly 100 years, the world was witnessed a reversal of North and South powers. At the end of World War II, developed countries account for 70% of world GDP, while developing countries and poor countries account for only 30%. Developed countries used to be G7 at that time. So far, emerging economies such as BRICS countries and the developing countries, they develop very rapidly, and in addition, including Colombia, Vietnam, Indonesia, they called six countries, and Vista countries, new trading 11 countries. They are all emerging economy and developing countries. The proportion they have reached the 56% of global GDP, while developed countries have dropped to 44%. And it is estimated that by 2035, emerging economy and developing countries will account for about 70% of world GDP. So the developed country will account for only 30%. So now I think it is an opportunity for BRICS countries to change the WTO rules, because according to WTO rules made by developed countries, they want to keep the advantage of their country in the high level industries, especially high tech industries and modern service sector, and keep the developing country in the low end industry, such as labor intensive industry. So we all want to develop the high technology industry. Each country wants to do this because they can make more money. But through GVC model, developed country can make us lock up our technology to upgrading. So I think we want it's an opportunity because the power is transferred, and the trade center are shifting from western to east. So the South country, including BRICS members, we can take more important roles on WTO reform. So that's my opinions.
Dr. Shen, thank you very much for your answer. I believe that another speaker from our panel, Mr. Prinsloo, may also have some additional comments. So, Mr. Prinsloo.
I think if we look at BRICS cooperation within the WTO in the past, you know, the sentiment is that given the nature of our economies, different structure of our economies, BRICS haven't always been able to agree on some of the technical points, and I think that's not necessarily a massive concern for us. I think it's natural that in any group of country, whether it's the G7, the BRICS, or the G20, there'll be some differences. However, I did stress that it's important that, and in the case of the BRICS, we do share the principles around which the global multilateral rules-based trading order is built in terms of the primacy of the WTO. I think the role of developing countries, different dispensations needed for developing countries. I think Dr. Sharma highlighted that perhaps we need to re-look at those different dispensations. But in principle, I think at least we can all agree on this issue. And then, of course, also the issue of the dispute settlement unit. The importance of the DSU. So despite the fact that that, you know, there are differences within the BRICS when it comes to the WTO. I think we can coalesce around some of the key principles, and we should do that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to pass the floor to Professor Daniltsev, followed by Dr. Mtembu and Mrs. Olga Ponomaryova. So Professor Daniltsev, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I think I mentioned this item in my intervention, but the problem is really important, so that I will be glad to comment further. Of course, the structure of economies of our countries differ, and of course, we can have quite different sectoral interests and priorities. But, all BRICS countries are export dependent and export oriented countries. So that I think the main task here for us is to demonstrate our interests in further development of multilateral systems. And the main idea for me is how to demonstrate our common political will to develop and strengthen the WTO system, because we are quite interested in smooth developing and rules guided international trade. And I think that's the main idea and the main task for us, because for any negotiation, system and any international community, the political will is very important, and it is a key element of success. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mtembu.
Thank you, colleagues. I think my previous colleagues have covered a lot of the points on this. I think it's just to re-emphasize that it's I agree that it's, while the world trading system is under attack, both from within the developed countries, and obviously the famous example and the most known example is the US position on the WTO. But I do think that we, as developing countries, we also need to read the changing environment, but also not be too reactive. So we need to be proactively having these engagements amongst BRICS countries. How do we see the future of the WTO evolving? We need to be the ones putting proposals in consultation with other countries, in the developing world, so that we're not caught reacting. Because the reality is that if we only stick to, let's say, fundamental positions that were there for the Doha round, if we only stick to that, then there's a chance that there will be deadlock continuing, and that essentially at the end of the day, we're not going to get what we want, and may have to find ourselves adapting to the standards that other countries have been negotiating through plurilateral type agreements. So I think it's about being proactive. It's about realizing, yes, the challenges within the WTO, but in actually, whether it's in the e-commerce treaty, whether it's in reducing, trade barriers and so forth, we need to be the ones that are actively putting out, ideas based on the research that is taking place amongst our countries and the engagements that we're having.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ntembu. Dear colleagues, we still have several questions, so I would like just to make another round of questions. I would like to ask a couple of them probably, and then give a chance to each speaker or from our panel to answer. So the first question is from representative from Russia, Svetlana Gusarova, and the question is regarding particular projects between BRICS countries within GVCs. So Svetlana asks, what are the most effective joint projects of the BRICS countries? It's the first question. And the second question just came from the representative from South Africa and South African Institute of International Affairs. And the representative is saying, thank you for a fascinating set of presentations. There seems to be a clear consensus among the panel members about the importance of GVCs for a robust trading system, although there is a clear signs that some reshoring or at least shortening of value chains are likely. For trade to flourish, open markets are critical. So the question is, can we expect the BRICS to take the lead on lowering barriers to their markets to spur global trade? What steps could be taken to develop alternative trading paths or hubs? So I would like to ask our speakers to answer both this question or choose the one they prefer. So, and I would like to start it again with Mr. Sharma. Please, Mr. Sharma, the floor is yours.
Thank you. On the first point, what are concrete BRICS initiatives that could be taken forward? I think we don't. I mean, we have enough history of a history of discussions to pick up some that are already decided on, and that have increasing relevance at this particular point in time. The one that I would suggest is a discussion that has been going on for about 3 years and was reiterated in 2019 on regulatory harmonization, particularly when it comes to biotechnology and the medical supply chain. For obvious reasons, this is very important right now, and creating an institutional structure that could push us towards greater regulatory harmonization would demonstrate a commitment towards keeping medical supply chains, integrating them, keeping them open, and that's something that would be very useful. I think that's a concrete suggestion we can push forward. On the question of open markets and lowering barriers to markets, I think we have to look at barriers to markets in two different ways. On the one hand, I think that at this particular point, the question of tariffs has become, unfortunately, very has become political to a degree that maybe the BRICS coordination could not possibly break through any barriers at this point. However, what we should be thinking about is different and other barriers to integrated markets. And once again, I think we come to regulate what are called behind the border issues. We should start thinking about regulatory cooperation at a higher level than we have seen so far. And I think that that would be the first step towards ensuring that we are taking the lead in maintaining existing and expanding existing global value chains. Non-tariff barriers of various sorts have to be addressed by BRICS at an expedited level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Shen, please.
Okay. I think we can do some matter to go forward. Firstly, we can improve our internal environment, including industry system and the transportation system. Now we can we found it is very important for us, the emergency management ability our government, hospital and medical team this is important, more important. So we need to improve and develop doing business environment to bring the foreign capital and cultivate inland business. And secondly, we need more cooperations and makes the global market smooth and connected. Because for our developing countries, especially BRICS countries, more and more open global market, we can use the compared advantage to develop the potential industry. So the internal and external environment is both important for us to go forward. That's all.
Thank you very much, Professor Shane. So, Mr. Prinsloo, the floor is yours, I guess.
A brief response to the second question around opening up of the BRICS. I think one of the things that our former Minister of Trade said that under the WTO, perhaps in some cases South Africa liberalized some of our tariffs on goods too fast. And I think what South Africa, along with many developing countries, discovered 10, 20 years later is that this has actually restricted a lot of the policy space for developing economies, especially where we have nascent industries that simply cannot compete with international markets. And I think, again, I don't think that is the sentiment just in South Africa. I think we see it in many developing countries, the realization that countries need to have some space to maneuver, to designate some industries as nationally important, and to offer some protection for those industries from international competition. Having said that, and again, in the case of South Africa, that doesn't mean we've abandoned at all the notion of the importance of open and free trade. Again, I think if we look at the ongoing continental discussion, South Africa is a key voice in the continental free trade area that aims at lowering tariff barriers or liberalizing 97% of tariff barriers between 55 African Union member states. So certainly South Africa has been a key proponent of that. So yeah, those are just reflections on tariff liberalization, opening up borders. I tend to agree with Dr. Sharma that in a world where so many countries are part of the WTO, there's so many various regional free trade areas around. The impact of tariffs on trade is less. Behind the border or the non-tariff barriers are bigger barriers often facing traders than tariffs, and certainly that is something the BRICS needs to look at, as well as G20 countries who are very prominent offenders when it comes to erecting non-tariff barriers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Daniltsev, I guess the floor is yours also.
Yes, thank you. Well, as for the first question, I think it's not possible now to analyze some particular projects and maybe elements of cooperation, but I think that the most easy and very effective area for cooperation is in the investment area, and of course it is very useful, I think, for all our economies, and it is not limited somehow by the structure of industries, so that investment cooperation in the area of investment and facilitating investment is very important for us. Well, as for problem of trade barriers, as it was mentioned earlier, well, I think neither elements in it should be ignored, because, well, many people thought that, well, now trade barriers are not very important, but now, as we speak about global value change, we see that even very low trade barriers should be taken into consideration. And on the other hand, I would say that, well, of course, we must remember that we are living in a, well, real world, and we must understand that all the trade regulations and even trade barriers somehow play important role, that they facilitate the development of national industries, and well, we know that, for example, well, the GATT system was famous for its well, rubber rules, which somehow enabled particular members to well follow their national interests. And well, I think it's time to make the, for example, the WTO rules more problem-oriented and more responsive to different problems, such pandemic issues or others, and it will well just make the system stronger. As for regional cooperation, it is a very important thing, and well, I don't see any contradiction between the multilateral and regional approach, because in fact they follow the one aim and one target. So that to make the environment more convenient for trade, and well, the ways to implement it are different, but I don't see there is need somehow to see any contradiction between them. But in fact, the regional cooperation projects shall be transparent and shall be somehow associated with multilateral rules, and they should be harmonized and somehow make well, just provide for cooperation between them. And well, I see that we must see all possible ways, and don't say that we should change only one alternative. Many ways can be suitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dr. Mtembo, it's your turn, I believe.
Thank you. So just briefly, just to add on to the previous speakers, I think mine is just to add that some of the new or alternative
Yeah, sure.
trading, some of the alternative trading parts and hubs. I just point, for instance, to one. I mean, or at least maybe to two. Let me, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and what has been, committed within the realm of the Belt and Road Initiative, and you see that it will present challenges, but it will present also opportunities, for interconnectivity within countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. If you look at also India's initiative, which seeks to also build greater interconnectivities with Africa, I think these are the new trading paths that are evolving, because even before COVID-19, we already were seeing a sort of fragmenting international trading system where you had, attempts around your transatlantic trade and investment partnership and other similar, agreements with what you could more so-called like-minded countries. But I think in that way, what's happening is that BRICS countries themselves find themselves at a position where they can also champion new and alternative trading paths, but also not restrict the trade partners that could potentially participate. For instance, if you look at what with the Belt and Road Initiative, there's been a lot of focus around bringing in international actors, both in the private sector, but also in the public sector, so that you keep the initiative not only China-centric, but you also include other actors who could potentially participate. And then lastly, it's just important to, speaking, on looking at the African landscape. I mean, if we are going to be trading more with one another, if we are going to be focusing on the continental free trade area, regional integration, we also have to understand that we also need that physical infrastructure in order to be able to trade more amongst one another. So I hope that as a continent, we're able to work with our BRICS partners, but also other external partners in ensuring that the type of infrastructure projects that we see on the continent are not only limited to the national level, but that we're also seeing more interconnectivity projects within the continent.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ponomaryova, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I would like to comment on trade liberalization and the formation of alternative production hubs. From my point of view, trade liberalization and lowering of trade barriers in mutual trade, specifically between BRICS economies, is important area of economic recovery and the recovery of GVCs functioning. Of course, it's completely difficult to talk about short-term prospects of trade liberalization in so extreme situation as COVID pandemic, when not all consequences actually understood and analyzed in practice. But anyway, the first steps I suppose should be done in intensified coordination between government and businesses, and it is of vital importance to understand the risks which businesses face nowadays and the needs for their participation in GVCs, their production needs. And moreover, I totally agree with that among the first steps, there should be regulatory coherence as more or less soft steps for mutual cooperation, and it should be considered, for example, in the sphere of standards and technical regulation, to add flexibility to global value chains, as I've already highlighted in my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. Dear colleagues, I believe we are already run out of time. We do have several more questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to cover them right now during the webinar, but we will be happy if you could send your questions to organizers, and we will circulate your questions among the participants and speakers for them to answer. So I believe that we had very fruitful discussion today, and I would like to thank all the speakers and guests for joining us. And as it was discussed today, there is particular huge potential for BRICS countries to cooperate within GVCs frameworks, both within BRICS itself and on different international platforms, including G20, OECD, and WTO in particular. Definitely all of us, all countries, face particular and very serious challenges in terms of pandemic, but our mutual cooperation may bring particular benefits and help to overcome the crisis in our countries. So I would like to say in the very end of our webinar that from my point of view, today's discussion was a very good starting point for the initiative proposed by Russian Federation, and we will be waiting for the decision from our officials on the Russian proposal, but still we really hope that we will have another opportunity to talk, to discuss, and to come with the ideas on GVC's cooperation within BRICS. And the last point, dear colleagues, I thank you again for joining us, and probably we will try to take joint picture. And those of you who can just switch on your cameras, please do it, and we will take a screen. So, and we'll take a picture of all our participants. Please do it.
And also, final thank you from me and from the Expert Council. And we are also looking forward to seeing all of you on our other events. This was the first in the series of international roundtables for all the BRICS countries, but not the last, obviously. We are having ahead of us, as you know, all of you have heard, today it was officially announced that the summit is no longer going to be held on the dates of the 21st to 23rd of July. The dates will be announced later, but it's likely to be in autumn. So we do have time for us to have both roundtables that are held online for BRICS, including in academia area and in civil society forums. So please tune in for the next events that are going to be held. And I'm quite sure that we will be seeing each other soon face to face, maybe before the summit or right after that, with their events that are traditional for BRICS, both academic and civil forums. So thank you again to Tatiana, special thanks to her, and to all the speakers that we've had today, and to all the participants that were listening. I think I've been talking long enough for everyone to turn on their cameras, which I still see some people hiding. So please, those of you who can, turn your cameras on, and we will take their family photo of our event.
So you can say cheese. Yeah, I guess we have it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everybody. And stay healthy, stay safe, and tune in. Let's stay together. Bye.